Jeff Nations, welcome to Inside the Taubman Approach.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Jeff, how did you come to know the Taubman work?
So it goes back a few years, maybe more than a few. And so the year was 1998 to be precise. And at the time I was, teaching privately. I actually taught at Settlement Music School in Philadelphia and was doing a fair amount of gigging, getting a fair amount of freelance work. And it was that year that I started to have pronounced issues for the first time. I had previously, I'd gone to music school, went to North Carolina School of the Arts. I had, there were times when I would experience fatigue in my playing, but nothing that really lasted or was debilitating. But that began to change, I would say, when I hit my mid-30s. And so I was doing, as I said, a lot of freelance work, and I started to have issues with my hands and arms. I developed tendonitis in both, and I could do all the things that they tell you to do. I could rest for a bit and whatnot, but invariably it always came back. And so I started doing a little bit of research, and I was trying to find somebody, and it was really seemed quite by happenstance at the time, sort of a miracle in a way. I was chatting with a friend of mine who knew a mutual friend, and he said that he could practice for hours at a time and he wouldn't get tired and all this kind of stuff. And so I was like, well, okay, it sounds like this is a good person for me to talk to. So I spoke to my friend, and he referred me to Bob Durso. And that was really the beginning of a journey for me. Of, I had to go through a retraining process. And it was at the time, it was a lot because I was like I said, I was in my mid-30s. I would say, although I had what I would describe now as gaps in my learning, gaps in my in sort of the technical foundation of my playing, but I was a formed player in many ways. So a lot of habits that were sort of cemented in. And so but I started my work with Bob Durso, and it really I I learned, what this Taubman thing was about. And there was something about it that really resonated for me because I was hearing things that made so much sense to me. Even though I didn't have the language to describe it when I was younger, I think there was some level of instinct for when I was hearing something from a teacher that was right on, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, if it was something that I just didn't buy at all. And when I met Bob and started working with him, and I heard all the things that he had to say, I might not fully have understood it all, but it made sense to me. And there was something that really resonated with me. And so that really started the whole journey, because I knew that for myself, I had to do something. I had to make a change, or that was going to be it. I really didn't see that there was a way forward, without making some fundamental changes. And so that's what I did.
So when you first came to Bob Durso, was there any kind of reticence on your part in terms of, hey, is this too good to be true?
Interestingly, I didn't feel that it was too good to be true. Um, I really didn't. I thought to myself, um, I think the way I felt was more, I feel like I've landed in just the right place.
Wow.
And it was amazing because, you know, the thing about it was he was a 10-minute walk from my apartment in Center
Oh my
City,
goodness.
you know,
Yeah.
and he had been there for some time at that point, and so had I. And it's like, the, so he's practically in my backyard, if I could say it that way, you know, and that was very, very fortuitous. And so, no, I wouldn't say I didn't feel it was too good to be true. I thought this sounds like what I wanted to hear all those years ago. I would say any reticence on my part, um, the probably the toughest thing I had to deal with in the early stages were the the notion of I took time off. I took time off from gigging because I asked him about it. I spoke to him about it, and he gave me his professional opinion, and I think it was exactly the right thing for me and exactly what I needed to hear. Now everybody's path is a little bit different, you know. But for me, I needed to take a block of time off. So he basically said to me, I think you should clear your calendar for about 6 months. And so I did. I cleared my calendar for 6 months. And there
Wow.
was and there was a point where I had um someone come to me. It was a violinist I was working with at the time that came to me and asked about doing something together in the spring. And I took it to Bob and I explained to him, you know, what this was. It would have been a gig doing the Franck Sonata, and he said, honestly, I wouldn't do it because at this point, it would just really kind of throw a monkey wrench into everything, because I would be so concerned about how I was sounding. The likelihood, because it was so early in the process for me, was that I was going to revert to old habits. And so I did I did what my teacher recommended. I did not do that performance. I did not. So I was like, okay, I'm very sorry. I'm not going to be able to do this, but that's what I did. And I think it was the right thing.
Yeah. So 6 months you were devoted to the process, weekly lessons, weekly kind of check-ins, maybe even more. What was that retraining like? I mean, were you just discovering new things like every moment? What was that like? Was it frustrating at times? Was it exciting at times?
Yeah. So I would say, I mean, there was a lot that happened within the first 6 months, I would say, for me, in terms of a whole range of feelings about all of it. I would say, and again, I want to say that, because we're all individuals, everybody's process is a little bit different. We learn differently. One of the things this work teaches us is that, we're as human beings, we're basically built the same. But in terms of learning process and learning curve and just the way each of us as an individual processes things, it can vary a lot from person to person. So for me, in the very beginning, I would say, like, the first leg of the work of retraining, like, when we go through this retraining process, there's a lot of work around, well, the fundamentals of, just sitting at the correct height, getting the proper alignment, learning how to drop and balance on a finger, learning the rotation, and all of it. And that's just part of it. I'm not explaining everything fully, but just for the sake of time. But all of it building up to playing a C scale, a C major scale, and doing it well, utilizing the principles of the Taubman approach. And so that part of it went very quickly for me. It just it went quite fast. I would say it was 4 to 5 weeks, and
Mhm.
I had basically covered that. But then I did sort of hit a plateau shortly after, and so um, it was it was uh uh it was a process of, just the whole process of taking what I had learned and then applying it to a piece of music was a little bit more challenging for me. Um, and I went through probably I would say in the months that followed subsequent to that, you know, a little bit of a back and forth sometimes, because what I was dealing with was, basically I had this new thing that I was gaining ground on. It was working really well, but those old habits really fought hard, you know. And so um uh, I experienced a whole range of feelings and emotions, I would say, in the early stages. Um, um, but I also noticed that the more I stayed with it, the more answers came to light, and I really came to believe, and I still believe this to this day, that there really is no problem that there isn't a solution for, when it comes to this work.
Yeah, that's really well said. Um, you were experiencing symptoms of tendonitis in your arms when you first went to Bob.
Yes.
So, how far after studying with Bob did those symptoms kind of recede into the background? Did you notice an immediate improvement of those symptoms?
The interesting thing is that the first thing that happened for me, it was to me, I thought it was bizarre. It was a bizarre, but I welcomed it, which was, even though my symptoms didn't go away immediately entirely, they did start to go away when I was actually at the piano, you know. So I might have symptoms.
Oh,
I would sit down to practice, and I wouldn't feel anything, and any of those symptoms. It was like it it you know, I'm not a doctor, and this might sound corny, but it felt like the practice was actually medicine for me. And so over time, what happened, and it took a while, but over time it did start to recede, in, day to day life as well. And I had an experience, within I think it was within the first couple of years that I studied with Bob. And I remember it very well because I went in for a lesson and he said something about my injury. And in that very moment that he said it, I had forgotten that I had had an injury. And I looked at it,
wow.
injury? Like there was just a moment, it was like a knee jerk reaction. I didn't even have a recollection of it. Of course, you asked me, I know that there was one, but in that moment, it was as though, what are you talking about? Because my experience then was like, I felt so healthy. My hands felt so healthy when I was playing, and I just didn't. It wasn't part of my experience.
I hear that over and over again from folks that have been in the work, just to say, hey, this process takes over sort of the playing apparatus, and you forget about how you played before. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. Are you teaching? You're teaching in Philadelphia. You're playing wonderfully in Philadelphia, based in Philadelphia. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in your life now, these decades later that you went to Bob.
Right. So one of the things that changed a lot for me, as I think it did for a number of people, um, that teach is that the pandemic changed everything. It was a real game changer, and it was during that time that at first my first reaction to all that, of course, was that I was going to stop. I had no idea. Like none of us, when COVID first hit, knew what was going to happen. Really, you know. Um, but it was really through a parent of one of my students kind of egging me on to try this thing called Zoom. So I tried it out, and at the time, you know, this is all I had to do it on. I didn't have even a laptop.
Wow, Jeff.
So I was doing it on my iPhone. I was doing it all on my iPhone. And then months into it, I was able to invest in a laptop. I got a MacBook, and I started teaching remotely. So I have a combination now of in-person and remote students. Um, and I'm really grateful that, I've been able to reach people remotely that otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to do this. At one point, not teaching him now, but at one point I was teaching a young guy in Thailand, you know?
Wow.
So, um, I have students in California. I've got a student in the Midwest. I have some in-person students. So basically, I have a sort of kind of I would say kind of three-tiered or three-pronged career. I've got my private studio. I am a music director in an Episcopal church, and as well, am an accompanist for a choir in Philadelphia. So,
Fantastic.
and so those are some of the things that I'm doing, and I continue to you know, occasionally, take on other types of gigs as they come my way. But those are the main things that I'm focusing on right now. I'm really interested in um, just to um, continuing to work on my own playing because I find, and my teaching as well.
Right.
For me, those two things have always been. There's a very strong symbiotic relationship between the teaching and the playing. And because my students challenge me, and as much as they ask me questions, I'm sometimes they're not always so easy to answer. I have to do a little bit of digging, but, I also love the challenge of that. And so, um, I'm oftentimes, you know, going back and looking at certain pieces, maybe pieces that I had not worked on previously, you know, some of my students may be working on, and examining, what's going on, how does this work? There have been occasionally pieces that I never had any particular interest in performing, you know, but I was keenly interested in what was it that would make this piece work from a biomechanical standpoint. So my curiosity um, is pretty strong, and I'm finding that I I continue um, grow in this. It's like it's an infinite world unto itself, I would say.
I love that. And you mentioned, ever learning about, different kinds of biomechanics as it relates to the Taubman approach. And you also alluded to the fact that it is a mindset shift in terms of how you look at music and how you look at the instrument. You've mentioned earlier in the interview to say there's not a problem that doesn't feel like it can be solved. When problems appear before us, whether in teaching or in repertoire, there's a way to tackle these problems based on the Taubman approach.
Yes.
And that's been your experience.
Yes.
What are some kinds of exciting things that you are just loving right now in your studio, and in your private practice as a performer? What are some things that are just stunning you even to this day in the work?
Hmm. I had made a shift um in terms of my students. Like I taught for many years. I taught a lot of children. Um and that was a good thing for me. But things started to change, and I think partially it was changing as as I said, there was a type of shift that was going on with the pandemic, and I found um, I was getting a number of requests from adult students from various parts of the country, um, some of which were even quite a few referrals that were made to me. And I'm teaching at this point really not predominantly, just exclusively adults, which is
Interesting.
which
Yeah.
is a very different animal in a sense. And I love kids. I do. I feel somehow for myself, and because I think everybody's different in this regard, I think some people probably gravitate more towards teaching children and some the other way. And so I'm finding I really feel a certain sense of, again, like almost like landing in the right place with these students at this time, because it just feels like a good fit to me. And the fact that I'm able to, because of this work, I'm able to answer questions and I'm able to help players that are really pretty advanced, So that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's very exciting. That's very
Yeah.
exciting, Jeff. And so you've basically transitioned to various levels of adult players,
Yes,
beginners, intermediate, advanced. And wow, that's got to be really exciting for you.
it is. I would say it is, and it's uh very much so. It very much so. Um so and as I said, the teaching and the playing are so very closely linked for me. So as I sort of delve deeper into this world with my students, it sparks my curiosity even further. It sparks my curiosity about my own playing, you know, um, um, and it makes me want to go deeper. It makes me want to go deeper into this work. So because I just find that there's so much to be gained from that.
And dear listener, as you're listening to this podcast episode, we're going to be including all things Jeff related in the show notes. And if you're in the Philadelphia area, or if you have access to a computer or a phone, we want to encourage you to reach out to Jeff and see if it's possible to study with this amazing teacher, Jeff Nations. Jeff, where can folks find out more about you? We'll include all of these links, of course, in the show notes, but where can they find out more about you?
Sure. A couple places I would say that the main would be there is the Golandsky Institute website, um, which I believe is
Dot
GolandskyInstitute.org.
.org. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely.
That's one place they can find out about me, and I have my own website as well. So that would be jeffnations.net.
.net. Excellent. And yes, dear listener, reach out to GolandskyInstitute.org to request a teacher and a certified teacher in this incredible work. The Taubman approach is so detailed and so complex, and yet so simple that you need a qualified teacher in this work. And Jeff is one of these amazing teachers that is featured on our website, GolandskyInstitute.org. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today on Inside the Taubman Approach. We're going to have to get coffee together because I'm actually in Philadelphia right now. We'll have to get coffee and talk more about this, and we'll have you on the podcast again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care.